Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Gopi Janavalabha Girivaradhari Jaya Gopi Janavalabha Girivaradhari Yashodanandana Braja Janarandana Yashodanandana Braja Janarandana Yamuna Tira Vanachari Yamuna Tira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kanda Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kanda Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunda Bihari Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Jnanatimirandasya Kananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manopishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vanchakalpatirubhyascha Kripasindhubhyevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So we're reading today from Srimad Bhagavatam, 7th canto, chapter 7, what Prahlad learned in the womb. I think it's actually, what Prahlad learned in the womb. He's speaking to the demon boys. Text 40. Evam hi loka kritubhi kritami Kshaishnava Satishayana Nirmala Tasmadadrishta Shruta Dushanam Param Bhaktyogtayesham Bhajatatma Labdhaye Evam Hiloka Kritubhi Kritami Kshaishnava Satishayana Nirmala Tasmadadrishta Shruta Dushanam Param Bhaktyogtayesham Bhajatatma Labdhaye Evam Hiloka Kritubhi Kritami Kshaishnava Satishayana Nirmala Tasmadadrishta Shruta Dushanam Param Bhaktyogtayesham Bhajatatma Labdhaye Evam Hiloka Kritubhi Kritami Kshaishnava Satishayana Nirmala Tasmadadrishta Shrutam Dushanam Param Bhaktyogtayesham Bhajatatma Labdhaye. Anyone else? Evam Hiloka Kritubhi Kritami Kshaishnava Satishayana Nirmala Tasmadadrishta Shruta Dushanam Param Bhaktyogtayesham Bhajatatma Labdhaye. Evam. Similarly, as earthly wealth and possessions are impermanent, he, indeed, lokaha, higher planetary systems like heaven, the moon, the sun, and Pramaloka, Kritubhihi, by performing great sacrifices. Kritaha, achieved. Ami, all those. Kshaishnava, perishable, impermanent. Satishayaha, although more comfortable and pleasing. Na, not. Nirmalaha, pure, free from disturbances. Tasmat, therefore. Adrishta shruta, never seen or heard. Dushanam, whose fault. Param, the supreme. Bhaktya, with great devotional love. Uktaya, as described in the Vedic literature, not mixed with jnana or karma. Isham, the Supreme Lord. Bhajata, worship. Atmalabdhaye, for self-realization. Translation. It is learned from Vedic literature that by performing great sacrifices, one may elevate himself to the heavenly planets. However, although life on the heavenly planets is hundreds and thousands of times more comfortable than life on earth, the heavenly planets are not pure, nirmalam, or free from the taint of material existence. The heavenly planets are also temporary, and therefore they are not the goal of life. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, however, has never been seen or heard to possess inebriety. Consequently, for your own benefit and self-realization, you must worship the Lord with great devotion, as described in the revealed scriptures. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. As stated in Bhagavad Gita, Kshine punye martyalokam vishanti. Even if one is promoted to the higher planetary systems by performing great sacrifices, which are accompanied by the sinful act of sacrificing animals, the standard of happiness in Svargaloka is also not free from disturbances. There is a similar struggle for existence even for the king of heaven, Indra. Thus there is no practical benefit in promoting oneself to the heavenly planets. Indeed, from the heavenly planets one must return to the earth after one has exhausted the results of his pious activities. In the Vedas it is said, Tadyateha karma jito loka kshiyate evam evamutra punya jito loka kshiyata. As the material positions we acquire here by hard work are vanquished in due course of time, one's residence in the heavenly planets is also eventually vanquished. According to one's activities of piety, in different degrees, one obtains different standards of life, but none of them are permanent, and therefore they are all impure. Consequently, one should not endeavor to be promoted to the higher planetary systems, only to return to this earth or to descend still lower to the hellish planets. To stop this cycle of going up and coming down, one must take to Krishna consciousness. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu therefore said, Pramanda Pramite Kona Bhagyavan Jiva Guru Krishna Prasade Pai Bhakti Lata Bija. The living entity is rotating in the cycle of birth and death, going sometimes to the higher planets and sometimes to the lower planets. But that is not the solution to the problems of life. But if by the grace of Krishna one is fortunate enough to meet a guru, a representative of Krishna, one gets the clue to returning home back to Godhead, having achieved self-realization. This is what is actually desirable. Pajatatma labtaye. One must take to Krishna consciousness for self-realization. Okay, so I just wanted to, before I start speaking on this verse is very connected to the previous two verses. It's kind of like following from those two. And also, I just wanted to kind of give like a general overview of the flow of this chapter so far, like the flow of Prahlad's instructions to the demon boys so far. Because for me that kind of helps, like if I know the overarching structure of like the flow of the conversation, it helps me to make more sense of like the verse that we're looking at right now. So at the beginning of this chapter, Prahlad was just like narrating how he came to be instructed by Narada Muni. I won't really repeat that because I think we've been hearing this over the past few weeks, so I won't repeat that. But then after the narrative, he begins giving actual instruction to the demon boys, to the sons of the Asuras. And he begins by instructing them in jnana. But this is like jnana that's related to bhakti, because he's not just giving them knowledge about the difference between matter and spirit, but also knowledge about the Paramatma, the Lord situated in one's heart. And so he was explaining also the relationship between these three, how the spirit soul is actually eternal, and his body is just a temporary vessel for him. And the real objective is to search out the Lord of one's heart, the Paramatma. And the jiva, although he's really never actually touched by the modes of material nature, he's never really contaminated. He's sort of he's influenced by the modes of material nature. And Prahlad gives this analogy that in the same way that the air carries a fragrance, so similarly, but the air is still distinct from the fragrance. So similarly, the living entity, he's like carrying the modes of material nature. He's carrying the influence of the modes of material nature, but he's always distinct from that. He never gets mixed up. He always remains pure. But nevertheless, he's entangled in that way. And so then the question that would come up, well, okay, so now I know that the jiva is entangled in this way. His objective should be the Lord of the heart, but he's entangled in matter. So now what? What's the process for getting out of that? And Prahlad says, well, there's like thousands of processes. But the best process out of all of these processes is the one by which one can attain rati, prema, pure love of God. So, in other words, that's a segue to bhakti yoga, because that's the process by which one can attain prema. So, okay, bhakti yoga, this is the best process. How do I do that? How do I do that bhakti yoga? So then Prahlad Maharaj, he spends a few verses explaining the angas of devotional service, the processes. So, okay, you find a bona fide spiritual master, and you surrender to him. You worship the deity in the temple, and especially you hear and chant about the Supreme Lord, his activities, his qualities, and everything. And he mentions other angas, but especially those ones, especially hearing and chanting. So then, okay, well, what will be the result of that if I take to this process? He's saying you'll be absorbed in total transcendental jubilation, just chanting the Lord's names like a madman with so much taste for it. And of course, all anger, greed, and envy will just be totally cleansed from the heart. And for somebody who's so intimately in touch with the Lord, there's no question of the repeated birth and death. So such a person is just totally out of the material situation, totally transcendentally situated. And that brings us all the way up to verse 38, which is 2 verses before this one. And I said I wanted to explain those 2 verses just a little bit because it kind of like leads us into this one. So in 38, Prahlad Maharaj, he just explained the process of bhakti yoga, and now he wants to get them to like take it up. Like, you should really take this up. This will really be good for you. And so in verse 38, he's basically saying, koti prayaso. The nice thing about this bhakti yoga is it's not very difficult to do. It's actually really easy compared to other processes. What's so easy about it? What makes it so much simpler, so much more straightforward than other processes? Prahlad Maharaj explained, well, for one thing, the object of devotional service is the Supreme Lord, and He's already located in your heart. So you don't have to like go anywhere and look for Him. You don't have to like go into the Himalayas. You don't have to go look for some great learned pandit or anything like that. You can actually stay in your position and worship the Lord of your heart, in whatever you're doing, because He's already right there. So that's one of the ways that makes it easier. Another way is that He's the supreme friend of every single living entity. And so it's easy to worship somebody who's your friend, because that's somebody who has affection for you. It's easy to surrender to such a person. Just like maybe we've been in situations before where we had like a boss or some authority who we didn't really feel was really too concerned about our own well-being, And so it might be a little bit difficult for us to take instructions from that person, to submit to that person, because we're thinking, well, is this person going to just exploit me, take advantage of me? But if that person were your friend, then it's really easy. Oh, this is a person who's my friend, and they actually have affection for me. So then it's easier to submit to that kind of authority. So Krishna is the supreme friend of every living being. So it's very easy to worship Him and to surrender to Him. And finally, like I mentioned, Prahlad is saying, like I mentioned before, this hearing and chanting about Krishna, this is like the main activity of devotional service. And all you need for that is one tongue and a couple of ears, and you already have that. So you don't have to go looking for all kinds of ingredients and then bring them back like maybe some some yajna, you have to acquire so much ghee, so much incense, so much paraphernalia. But this is just this yajna, this nam yajna, Harinam Sankirtan yajna, is just done with a tongue and 2 ears. So this process compared to others is so much easier. And then he finishes this verse with Kim Vishayopapadanai. And so this is what's really going to give the segue into the next couple of verses. Because this means, why are people so addicted to unnecessarily producing artificial paraphernalia for sense gratification? Why are they so busy with the activities by which they can enjoy their senses? Because those activities actually require like a lot of endeavor. We were hearing Prabhupada in the purport saying that these activities only lead one to hell, and yet one is endeavoring so hard for them. So one is endeavoring so much just to end up in a hellish planet. On the other hand, devotional service, remember, is so nice. The result of devotional service is just you get free from the cycle of repeated birth and death, and you enjoy transcendental jubilation. And it's so easy, and yet this process is so difficult, and you only go to hell for practicing it. So which one sounds better, So that's what he's asking. He's making that contrast. Kim Vishayopapadanai. And Prabhupada, in the word-for-word translation, he translates this as, what is the need for activities delivering the objects of the senses for sense enjoyment? So sense enjoyment is kama. There's dharma, artha, kama, and moksha. These are the 4 principles of society. But before you can have kama, before you can have sense gratification, you require sense objects. Because in order for me to get enjoyment, I have to have some desirable sense object, and then my senses will come into contact with it, and then I'll suck up some pleasure from it, So first, before you can have sense gratification, you need sense objects. Well, how do you get the sense objects? Economic development. So you require economic development. So this is what this is referring to. The activities which deliver the objects of the senses so that one can have sense enjoyment. So is artha and kama. So that's what he's saying. What's the point of dedicating the human form of life to economic development just to get sense objects, just so that you can have a little bit of sense gratification, which is temporary? And the funny thing about this is, if you ask this question to most ordinary people, they would just be like, what? What's the problem with that? That's just normal. That's just life, What's wrong with that? So I work an honest job. I get, and with my hard-earned money from that, I have, I buy some Cheez-Its and a nice TV and a couch so I can be comfortable, and a nice apartment. So what's wrong with that? Enjoying the fruits of my hard-earned labor, honest work, So this is segueing into the next verse, because in verse 39, Prahlad Maharaj is going to begin explaining just exactly what's wrong with that. And actually verse 39 begins a string of 10 verses where Prahlad Maharaj explains, basically just lays out all the faults of dedicating the human form of life to economic development and sense gratification. So 39, he's basically giving a big list of all the sense objects that people generally find dear to them, like riches, a beautiful wife, sons, pets, a big bank account. And he's referring to all of these things as kshana bhangura, which means that they can be destroyed at any moment, actually. Kshana means just a moment, and bhangura means perishable. So they're perishable at any moment. And so Prahlad Maharaj is asking the question, kiyat priyam, which means what kind of pleasure do you hope to derive from that? These sense objects and all varieties of sense gratification are completely temporary, they're flickering. And not only that, but the lifetime in which one would even hope to enjoy those things, that lifetime is itself flickering, so it can disappear at any moment. So if that's the situation, Kiyat priyam, what kind of pleasure do you hope to derive from a situation like that, where at any moment the objects of your happiness can just disappear? So now that brings us to today's verse. So the first line is Evam hi loka kartubhi krita ami. So loka, the higher planetary systems like heaven, the moon, the sun, and Brahma loka. Kartupi, those can be attained by performing great sacrifices. Krita, they can be achieved. Ami, all those various kinds of heavenly destinations can be attained. And the word evam at the beginning of this verse is significant because this means similarly. In other words, it's referring to the previous verse. Like, remember those things that I mentioned? Like, just ordinary riches and bank account and wife and sons and house, things like that. Well, attaining the heavenly planets is in the same category as those things. So some people, you might find in India, persons who are in the Himalayas performing austerities and great austerities and sacrifices. They may have a vow to never sit down, like they're always standing up, or like they sit in a ring of fire in the middle of summer just to endure the heat. And such persons would seem to be like great renunciates, like, wow, he's totally detached from all the things that Prahlad Maharaj mentions in the 39th verse: riches, wife, kids, house, pets, bank account. He's totally detached from all of that. But if you ask him why he's doing that, some of them will say that I'm trying to attain the heavenly planets. So this word evam is significant because he's saying, well, wait a minute, but the heavenly planets, you gave up all these other things like riches and wife, but the heavenly planets, that's in the same category as all of those things. It's just as temporary as those things. So somebody might somehow think that the heavenly planets are a nicer destination. But he's saying, evam, no, those are similar to the previous things I mentioned. They're in the exact same category. They are kshaishnava. They are temporary. And they are also na nirmala, which translates as impure. And impure, they're referred to as being impure because, as Prabhupada says here, they're also not free, the heavenly planets are not free from disturbances. There are also disturbances in the heavenly planet. So that's one of the first things that Prabhupada points out in his purport. He says, as stated in Bhagavad Gita, Kshine punye martyalokam vishanti, that even if one is promoted to higher planetary systems by performing great sacrifices, they have to come back down. They can't keep that heavenly pleasure. And another reason that the heavenly planets are considered impure is because there's also envy and greed and things like this in the heavenly planets. Prabhupada mentions Indra, that even for Indra there's this struggle for existence. And we see that sometimes Indradev, he becomes envious or greedy. And he's the king of heaven. He's like the top personality in heaven. And even he is not free from these kinds of disturbances. So that's why the heavenly planets are considered non-nirmala, impure. So then there's this word satishaya, which means that, okay, yeah, it's true. The heavenly planets are more comfortable and more pleasing than the earth planet. But that happiness is attained only according to the amount of punya that one is able to generate by their sacrifices and austerities. So there's actually like different grades of heavenly planets. In some of them, people live for like millions of years. In some, it's like hundreds of thousands. Some like 10,000, and some like 1,000. And so if you don't perform enough austerity, you'll end up at one of like the 1,000 life planets or 10,000 life planets. And so even though you may get some temporary enjoyment, you have to work really, really hard for that. And so why work so hard for something that's actually very temporary? So that's what Prabhupada is explaining in this statement, where he's saying it's according to one's activities of piety in different degrees that one obtains the different standards of life, including the different standards of like heavenly life. But no matter how hard one works to attain like this degree, this standard, or I'm going to go for the highest standard of Swargaloka, either way, none of them are permanent, and therefore they're all to be considered impure. And Prabhupada quotes an often quoted verse from Chaitanya Charitamrita, Ramanda Pramite Kona Bhagyavan Jeev, Guru Krishna Prasade Pai Bhakti Lata Bij. And I like this statement I like how Prabhupada translates it in this context. The statement is like this: the living entity is rotating in a cycle of birth and death, going sometimes to the higher planets and sometimes to the lower planets. But that is not the solution to the problems of life. In other words, he kind of presents it like, these heavenly planets are quite temporary, so that's not a solution to the problems of life. So then what is the solution to the problem of life? That should be the next question that pops up in our head. So the third line begins with tasmat, which means therefore. So that means this is the start of a different section of this verse. Therefore. So now Prahlad Maharaj is going to give the positive alternative, because he's not just a pessimist. Like, no, these riches, that's temporary, and wife and children, no, it's all nonsense, temporary, and heavenly planets. So he's saying that to withdraw our faith from these things, because we have lots of faith in matter. We think matter is very beautiful, and we're very attracted to it. And so because we have such faith in it, our movement is always in that direction, towards sense gratification. And so after kind of like smashing that, now he's tasmat, therefore, remember this is much better. So tasmat, he's saying, tasmat, therefore what should I do? Bhaktyokta bhajata. Let's see, how is that translated by Prabhupada? Bhaktya, with great devotional love, uktaya, as described in the Vedic literature, Isham, the Supreme Lord, bhajata, worship. So therefore, one should take to the worship of the Supreme Controller, the Supreme Lord, with great devotional love, according to how the Shastra advises, according to the Acharyas, how they direct us. Like Rupa Goswami's Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu is perfectly describing how to execute devotional service. So according to these kinds of literatures, we should take the devotional service and execute pure devotional service. He says, not mixed with jnana and karma, so that's pure devotional service he's hinting at. But then the question might come up, well, why should I do that instead of my sense gratification program? Okay, so you just pointed out so many faults in my sense gratification program, but how do I know there won't be any faults in this program also? So Prahlad Maharaj is referring to Krishna, he's referring to the Supreme, Param, as Adrishta Shruta Dushanam. Adrishta means not seen, Shruta means heard, and Dushanam refers to faults. And so Adrishta Shruta Dushanam means that person who has never been seen or heard to possess any faults whatsoever. So that's why this program is like definitely going to be a lot better than the other one, because Krishna as a person, the Supreme, is never been seen to have any or heard to have any faults whatsoever. So there's so many imperfections in the Artha Kama program, but there's no imperfections in Krishna, and this Bhakti Yoga system is centered around Krishna. So it is itself also faultless. So that's why it's so much better of an option. And so Prabhupada goes into that part at the very end of his purport. If by the grace of Krishna one is fortunate enough to meet a guru, a representative of Krishna, one gets the clue to returning home back to Godhead, having achieved self-realization. And so this is what is actually desirable. Bhajatatma labtaye. One must take to Krishna consciousness for self-realization. Atma labtaye refers to self-realization. So he's saying, for the sake of your own benefit, for the sake of attaining self-realization, you should worship the Lord with great devotion, as described in the revealed scriptures. And so that's basically the gist of this verse. And like I said, this is like a whole section. There's like the 10 verses where Prahlad Maharaj is just going to be like smashing on the material conception of life, really like challenging our faith in matter. So anybody who's really like attached to material enjoyment, they're going to feel really uncomfortable the next few verses. Just reading this verse and the one before it, I was kind of like wiggling nervously in my seat because it's like, oh man, he's exposing my whole mentality. So in the coming verses, he's gonna like, Prahlad Maharaj will hear that. He's just gonna like smash again and again. Like, he's gonna make sense gratification look like the stupidest idea in the world. And especially one theme that's gonna come up a lot is Kshaishnava, how it's temporary. Because when you want to withdraw somebody's faith in like the materialistic idea that I'll live, I'll do my duty, and I'll enjoy the results, they really can't argue with the fact that if you just keep harping on this point that all these things are temporary, you can't really argue with it. So you're going to see the word temporary, 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 temporary come up again and again in these verses. Okay, I think that's basically all I'm exhausted on the subject, that's all I know. So I guess I can take some comments or questions. If you have questions, I probably won't be able to answer them, but we can give it a try.
Jai Haribo Prabhu, thank you for your class. In this purport, maybe you could explain, after I maybe elaborate on some of the points I'm going to mention. In this purport, Prabhupada mentions the Brahmanda Brahmite verse, where the living entity is rotating throughout the universe and only by the mercy of Guru and Krishna can he attain a bhakti, the seed of bhakti. So, of course, later in that series of verses, Lord Chaitanya says that what destroys our bhakti is like the mad elephant in fences, like a mad elephant walking into a garden and destroying everything. And it appears that we generally, from my personal experience, I'm sure others can relate to it, that we generally make offenses due to distinguishing between friends and enemies. Like our Hiranyakashipu, he offended Prahlad because Prahlad, he considered Prahlad his enemy when he disagreed with him. And I wanted to quote one verse I was appreciating in this regard, and I'll ask you a question in this. In a previous chapter, this is from the 7th canto, of course, chapter 5, verse 12. It's a really nice verse, I really like it. So it says, when the Supreme Personality of Godhead is pleased with the living entity because of his devotional service, one becomes a pandit and does not make distinctions between enemies, friends, and himself. Intelligently, he then thinks, every one of us is an eternal servant of God, and therefore we are not different from one another. So my question is that in this verse it says that one becomes a pandit when one is pleased to Supreme Personality of God, and the result of that wisdom is that one doesn't distinguish between friends and enemies. So for most of us who maybe not be so, we can't remember things, sastras, and so sometimes we may become discouraged to preach or whatever, and we may not consider ourselves learned. Of course we're not learned, God has given us all the wisdom, but it appears from this verse that the standard of wisdom is not how much one can acquire or memorize and recite, but the standard of wisdom appears that when one becomes wise, one doesn't distinguish between friends and enemies, because we may have a lot of wisdom, but if somebody says something to us, then we may kill them, like Hiranyakashipu. And so can you elaborate on that point? How not to become discouraged, what's the real standard of wisdom according to your realizations, or maybe you can elaborate on this point.
What was your final question? How to not be discouraged?
On the practical side, my question is, for many of us, we may become discouraged that I can't remember, there's so many books in Krishna consciousness, Nectar of Devotion, Nectar of Instruction, Bhagavatam, a million verses, and I may become discouraged that, I can't memorize it so much, where do I start? And therefore one may consider himself ignorant, where they see some other devotees maybe, can memorize a lot and recite it. And that doesn't mean that they're not advanced. Of course they could be advanced, but it appears that from this verse that the standard of advancement is not how much one can memorize, but basically one's ability to not distinguish between friends and enemies. because we kind of ruin our lives, between, distinguishing between, and it appears that's the standard of wisdom. So maybe you could elaborate on those points of your realizations. Are you able to?
Okay.
So I apologize if it's not clear.
No, that's okay. So I guess you're kind of I guess what I'm understanding from this is that one might be a little bit discouraged by one's technical ability to remember shlokas, to maybe systematically understand the Bhagavad Gita or something like that. I'm not really sure what to say. I guess I don't really have any realizations about this because it's not coming up. So.
Well, one story I'm appreciating. Maybe I could just make a comment. Maybe you could make a comment. The reason I really love this verse is because we could see in the material world that despite having a high education, and it could equally apply to spiritual education. Like, for example, I'll give one story. It's kind of mundane, but it's a story that happens in everyday life. We could see that there was this one female dentist, and her boyfriend broke up with her because he wanted to go out with another woman, of course, sense gratification. And so maybe a few weeks later, he had a toothache, and he actually went back to his former girlfriend to get it fixed. Obviously, that was his mistake. And so she actually, after she put him under anesthesia, anesthesia?
I think
she
so.
actually removed all of his teeth to get revenge. And she went to jail, ruined her career. And so we could see that in life, that despite having high education, when one distinguishes between friends and enemies, now you ruin everything that you worked so hard for. So in much the same way, when we cultivate this spiritual wisdom, it appears that the standard of wisdom is not how much you can acquire or memorize, because at any second you can ruin your life because you're distinguished between friends and enemies. So that's kind of the perspective I'm coming from, that the real standard of wisdom, it appears, is that we ruin our lives by distinguishing between friends and enemies. We commit Vaishnava aparad, or we may do something, or kill somebody in the material world. And it seems like we shouldn't necessarily become so discouraged just because we can't memorize a million verses. But the real standard is when Krishna's pleased, he gives them the wisdom to not distinguish between friends and enemies. So that was kind of the perspective I was coming from. So.
Okay, I can say something on one point. I can say something on that point of ending up making offenses to the holy name, particularly the first offense of blaspheming Vaishnavas, as a result of developing this friends and enemies mentality. I was just hearing from the Chaitanya Charitamrita recently. This was during the time in Mahaprabhu's life where he was residing in Jagannath Puri, and the devotees from Gauda Desh, from Bengal, they would come every year for like a few months out of the year to come and visit Mahaprabhu. I think it would always be during the time of the Rath Yatra. They would come for a couple of months or so. And when they came one year, after their stay was finished and they were going to return back to Bengal, they were mainly householder devotees. And so they would ask Mahaprabhu this question, which was, Mahaprabhu, we're not, renunciates, we're householders, ingrained in material existence. What should we do? And they asked Mahaprabhu this question for 3 years in a row. And every year he gave basically the same answer to this question. He would say, Harinam Sankirtan. This is what you should do. You should get to come together and chant the holy names of the Lord. That's what you should do. But he would always give a second portion to that. And also, you should do, along with that, you should do Vaishnava Seva. Because the first offense to the holy name, he's advising them to chant the holy names together. And the best way to do that is to not make offenses also. And the first offense to the holy name is to blaspheme the devotees, the Vaishnavas. And so along with that, he was telling them, also you do Vaishnava Seva, so that you avoid making these kind of offense. And then they would always, each year, each of the 3 years, they asked him a follow-up question to that. And he gave a slightly different answer each year. The follow-up question is, okay, so you're telling us to do Vaishnava Seva, but who's a Vaishnava? That was the question, who's a Vaishnava? And the first year, Mahaprabhu's response was, when I hear someone chant Krishna's name, I consider that person to be a Vaishnava. If I hear them chant Krishna's name one time, I consider that person to be a Vaishnava. So that's kind of a safe way to go about it. If instead of the friends and enemies mentality, we just think, oh, this person, I heard them say Krishna one time, so they're a Vaishnava. So the Madhyama Adhikari he discriminates between 4 kinds of people. He develops love for Krishna, for the Supreme Lord. And with the devotees, he develops friendship. So anybody who's a Vaishnava, that person, I should develop friendship with them. And anybody who chants Krishna's name once is a Vaishnava. So we should try and, I guess, overcome the friends and enemies thing by that. Oh, he chanted Krishna one time, so he's a Vaishnava, and I should make friends with him. And I think the second year, Mahaprabhu answered this, if I'm remembering correctly, he answered this follow-up question, who is a Vaishnava? Second year he said, a Vaishnava is someone who chants the holy names carefully, or something like that, or attentively, or something like that. And I think the third year he gave even a slightly more precise answer, like a more serious answer. But in any case, we can remember that first definition, that Mahaprabhu considers that a person who's chanted Krishna's name one time is a Vaishnava, so don't treat them like an enemy. Anything else? All right, Jai Srila Prabhupada.